Today, I would like to talk to you about homophobia, homophobes, activists, and homosexuality in an African context. If I were doing a talk like this in Africa, I would be very scared because one of these three things could happen to me before the end of the talk. Number one, I could be booed or heckled off this stage, and that would be the mildest of the three things that can happen to me. Secondly, I could be physically or verbally attacked by those in the audience who would feel very affronted by the courage to speak about a subject matter like this in public. And thirdly, I could even be getting arrested, especially in those countries like Nigeria, where talking about a subject matter like this could be misconstrued as promoting homosexuality or corrupting public decency. And in certain circumstances, that could fetch you as much as 10 years imprisonment as punishment. So you see, if these are the outcomes that are reserved for people who simply speak about homosexuality, you cannot imagine for the life of me what homosexuals have to go through in a typical African country. But you see, in the midst of the horrors and abuses of rights violations that LGBTI people have to suffer on a daily basis, certain beautiful acts of courage that connect humanity in positive ways can take place. I have witnessed one of such when I served as a legal assistant at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I'm here to tell you that story because my involvement in this story was simply because I drafted a decision that granted observer status to a lesbian organization, and that was the first time that such had taken place in Africa. But before I tell you my story, I would like to draw out three ironies that this story exemplifies. And these contrasts are necessary and important because I want to be able to show you that we don't always need the right factors in place before we can make changes. I also want to be able to show you that fear and lack of sufficient knowledge should not incapacitate anyone from doing the right thing and from connecting humanity in positive ways. So, my first irony is what I call a topical irony. It's in the topic of my talk, and the topic says how courageous homophobes and fearful activists are fighting or combating homophobia in Africa. And then you all know that homophobes should promote homophobia, not combat it. And of course, activists should be fearless because that's the story we are told. The story of activism is always woven around fearlessness. But then, my argument is this. The twin factors of fear and ignorance are always with us. But in spite of them, we can push ahead and do the right thing. My second irony is what I call a geographical irony. These events I'm about to describe took place in a very small West African country called the Gambia. You see, the Gambia is so small that you wouldn't think that something tangible, something that would reverberate through the continent of Africa would happen there. In fact, the population of the Gambia is about 2 million. That's the population of an extended family in my country, Nigeria. So you see, the lesson here is this. You don't always need big spaces to make big changes. The third irony is in the political landscape of the Gambia. At that time in question, the Gambia had one of the worst human rights records on the continent. But it was from the same space that redemption took place. So the irony here is this. Sometimes redemption will often take place in the exact same space of the worst abuses. Let me tell you my story now. The date was the 25th of April, 2015. And the venue was the Kairaba Hotel in the Gambia. Something was about to happen. And we were sure that what was going to happen, not many people were going to be happy with it. Least of all the heads of state in Africa. And the reason why the heads of state in Africa were not going to be happy is this. The event that I'm describing was going to happen in Banjul, the Gambia. At that time, the Gambia was being headed by ex-President Yahya Jammeh, who was Africa's most despotic and perhaps most homophobic leader. Yahya Jammeh was the president who described gays as vermins. And at some point, he said that they are like mosquitoes. We must fight them the way we fight mosquitoes, perhaps more aggressively. This same president had a reaction to these events I'm about to describe. And his reaction was as reported by The Guardian as he could see. He said he was going to slit the throats of gays and lesbians in his country. And then he concluded by saying that no white person can do anything about it. And that was indeed ridiculous. But let me quickly say to you that Yahya Jammeh was not alone. He was expressing the views of many African leaders. And we know that African leaders, for a very long time, have always said, this gay thing is not our thing. We have to push it away. It cannot be. And like I said, many African leaders were rattled by these events I'm describing. We know they were rattled because some of them expressed anger at what had taken place. And we also know that by their previous actions and previous utterances, they were not at all pleased with what was going on. So for instance, we had the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who said that gays were worse than pigs and dogs. We had the president of Nigeria at that time, who signed into law a bill that criminalizes homosexual or same-sex marriage and everything connected to that. But the interesting thing about these examples I've given you, none of these guys is a president now. And I think that tells me one thing. Injustice, negativity, and in this context, homophobia. None of these vices can be the last man standing. Never. Let's delve into our story again. It was the 25th of April, 2015, about 3 years, exactly 3 years from this date that I'm speaking. And the venue was Kairaba Hall in Banjul. The commissioners of the African Commission, or in a language you would understand, the judges of the African Commission, had convened to take a decision on an application that had been pending before them. This application was from a non-governmental organization in South Africa called the Coalition of African Lesbians. What this organization wanted was a right to appear before the African Commission to report violation of rights of their members or anyone at all on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. The commission sat down and had to take a decision. But the way the commission works is that before that public session, members of the secretariat would have prepared a decision that would be decided upon by the commissioners. And in that circumstance, that was what was going to happen. And of course, you can imagine that there would be a lot of arguments. It was very controversial. Nobody wanted gay rights on the continent. But the commissioners were sure that we, at the African Commission, created with the duty to protect rights on the African continent, and we have to live up to expectation. There were 10 commissioners, actually, and a vote was to be taken. But in a 5-4 vote, with one abstention, the vote passed, and for the very first time, the African Union agreed with what right activists have always been saying, that LGBTI people are humans too, and their rights ought to be protected the way other rights are protected. This was a watershed moment. It had never happened before. And of course, there was jubilation from the camp of the people who should jubilate, and there were others who were not jubilating. But what had happened was very significant. And it was significant for two major reasons. Number one, the first time this organization approached the African Union was in 2008. Remember, this was 2015, 7 clear years after 2008. And at that time, the African Union said that the activities of that organization do not promote any of the rights enshrined in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So that application was rejected. The import of this is that for the first time, the African Union was backtracking or undoing what it had done. That was very significant because the African Union and most international organizations would almost never overrule themselves. The second reason why this was so important was because this was happening in Africa. Africa of all places. Africa is the last frontier of LGBTI rights in our world now. Africa is a place where 9 out of every 10 person cannot even imagine that their neighbors are gays or lesbians. Africa, more than any other continent, has the highest number of countries with laws in place that criminalize LGBT activities and lifestyle. So this was happening in Africa, and it was very, very significant. And you see, my friends have asked me that what do you think changed between 2008, when the African Union first rejected this application, and 2015, when it approved this application? I have tried to answer that question, and I think I have 2 explanations. The first would be that Africa was simply embracing the change that was sweeping across the globe. There is no stopping an idea whose time has come. It was just that time for Africa to begin to embrace that idea. I mean, time there was when apartheid was very fashionable and everyone supported it, or at least everyone in this side of the world. And time there was when slavery was very fashionable and people supported it. But a time came when those were just not acceptable again. And I think Africa is beginning to get to that point in history where we either embrace or we collapse. So that would be my first explanation. The second explanation would be that perhaps the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, between 2008 and 2015, had recruited not just courageous men and women into its secretariat. It is also that the commissioners of the African Commission have become very progressive due to trainings and constant capacitations from civil society organizations in Africa, foremost of which is the Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. It was from this same Center for Human Rights that I had graduated a year earlier, and this same center seconded me to work at the African Commission. At the African Commission, I knew my time was short, and I knew that if we were going to make a difference, it has to be now. But you see, my friends, sometimes you have the zeal, you have the knowledge, you have the technical know-how, but you may not have the opportunity. I had the opportunity, I had the zeal and technical know-how, and I was at the right place at the right time. For you, it may not be like that. So the question then is, if it happens that you have the technical knowledge and the zeal, but you don't have the opportunity, what do you do? Can you still make a difference? My answer would be yes, because not everyone will have opportunities thrust on them the way I had mine. Some of you will have to create an opportunity to make changes, to connect humans in positive ways. And you either do that or you're damned. You see, this story I've told you exemplifies 3 categories of people. The first category were people in my shoes, members of the Secretariat, who were very intelligent, had all the knowledge, and knew how to write decisions that would say that, yes, LGBTI people should have rights because they are included in the definition of humans according to the African Charter. The second category were the judges of the African Commission or the commissioners of the African Commission. Many of them didn't even understand the whole idea behind LGBT agenda. They kept saying, we don't even understand this thing. But as long as LGBTI people are humans, they should have rights, and we should protect those rights. They are the ones I have called the courageous homophobes. And the third category are the activists in Africa who work on a daily basis to ensure that rights of LGBTI people, and indeed every marginalized person, are protected. These are the fearful activists, because on a daily basis, they live in fear, but they keep working. So, I invite you to think for once, what will the world without discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, what would a world like that look like? One of my friends came here not long ago and spoke about the danger of compartmentalizing humans into identities. And I fully agree with that. But then, I'm ashamed to tell you that that world will never come to pass. You will never experience that world. Not when you keep thinking that you need certain superpowers or super abilities to make a world like that come into reality. My thesis is that everyone can change the world from the corners of their room, from where you are, no matter how small your space is. You just need to understand that the only thing you must not trade is your conscience. And sometimes, when you do this, it will come at great cost. But I charge you still to do what you have to do. Because once you do that, the only thing we can lose is the darkness that envelopes our world now because of discrimination on all of these bases of sexual orientation, gender, and nationality. The ball is in your court. Whatever you do, you must remember that you can make a change no matter how difficult it is. And you don't have to have superpowers to do that. Right where you are, you can make these changes. And once you have made your change, you might be left with no choice than to walk away. And I'm confident that I've done the right thing here today. And I simply will walk away. I thank you for listening.